I thought I had seen it all in San Francisco's Chinatown. But New York's Chinatown,
Your move.
what I found there shook me to the core.
This is getting
A hidden war, a forgotten empire, and a story more intense than I ever imagined. Let's rewind history and expose what's been buried for over a century. As always, before diving into the full story,
The time for talk is over.
please consider hitting the like button to support ADB Crime Case. Don't forget to subscribe to get notified about our latest investigations. Now let's begin. The year was 1850. As gold fever gripped the American West, tens of thousands of Chinese immigrants arrived in California, chasing prosperity in the gold mines and railroad camps. But not everyone came to swing pickaxes in the hills. Some headed east, to the heart of America's greatest city, New York. Back then, New York was a city of opportunity, but only if you were white, English-speaking, and male. Chinese immigrants, almost all men, were viewed with suspicion. By 1855, only 38 Chinese people lived in the entire city, just 38, and things would get worse before they got better. In 1882, the United States passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first major law banning immigration based on race. Chinese women were practically barred from entering, leaving behind a gender imbalance so severe it was nearly 6 men to every 1 woman by the year 1900. Imagine the tension, the loneliness, the competition. It created a pressure cooker. And in that pressure cooker, something powerful began to form. The Chinese immigrants needed support. They needed housing, work, protection, connection. And so they created tongs. In Cantonese, the word means hall or gathering place. But these weren't just social clubs. In Chinatown, the tongs became the backbone of Chinese life, a place to find a job, send money home, learn English, or just be around people who didn't stare at you like you didn't belong. At first, the tongs were peaceful, supportive, even noble. But New York City in the early 20th century was no place for idealists. This was a city run by crooked cops, corrupt politicians, and mobs that ruled entire boroughs. The Italian mafia, the Irish gangs, the Jewish syndicates. Everyone paid for protection, or they paid the price, and the Chinese were no exception. With no legal defense and no sympathy from the police, Chinatown turned inward. Protection came from within. The tongs, once community centers, slowly evolved into criminal organizations, complete with extortion rings, gambling dens, illegal import operations, and assassins. It wasn't just about crime. It was about survival. One tong would rise above them all. The Leong Tong. Founded in the Lower East Side, the Leongs were quiet, calculating, and dangerous. Their leader, Tom Lee, was a master of backroom deals. He didn't scream or shoot first. He paid off city officials, bought silence from cops, and built an empire behind closed doors. If you paid Tom Lee, he kept you safe. If you didn't, your building might mysteriously catch fire. In time, Tom Lee controlled virtually every transaction in Chinatown. Gambling, extortion, imports, you name it. He even gained enough clout to help elect local politicians. The Leongs weren't just a gang. They were a government inside a city that had forgotten them. And for a while they ruled unchallenged. But every empire has its rival. Every calm has its storm. In 1906, across the country, a natural disaster would ignite the next chapter in this war. A 7.9 magnitude earthquake leveled San Francisco, leaving its Chinese community in ruins. One Tong, displaced by the disaster, made the bold decision to move east, into Tom Lee's territory. Their name, the Hip Sing Tong. Led by a flamboyant and fearless gangster named Mock Duck, they weren't interested in playing by anyone else's rules. They weren't there to kneel or negotiate. They came to take. And Tom Lee wasn't going to let that happen without a fight. What followed would ignite one of the most violent feuds in New York history. A war waged not in headlines, but in alleyways, gambling halls, and dark corners of Chinatown. It would spill blood, claim lives, and leave a legacy that still echoes through the neighborhood to this day. But to understand how it got there, you have to understand how it began. Not with gunshots, not with fireworks, but with desperation and the need to belong. The Leong Tong thought they had won. For years, Tom Lee's grip over Chinatown was ironclad. He had the money, the cops, the city in his pocket. Every card game played, every shipment unloaded, every deal struck, it all ran through him. Chinatown, in his mind, was sealed, safe, untouchable. But nature doesn't ask for permission. On April 18, 1906, at exactly 5:12 a.m., the ground shook beneath San Francisco. A violent 7.9 magnitude earthquake split the city in two. Fires consumed what the quake spared. Over 80% of the city was destroyed, and thousands were left homeless, including San Francisco's powerful Chinese tongs. For some, it was the end. For others, it was an opportunity. One Tong in particular refused to die in the ashes. Instead, they boarded trains east. Their leader? A man draped in diamonds, gold, and swagger, Sai Wing Mock, better known by his street name, Mock Duck. Mock Duck wasn't just flashy, he was fearless. Unlike Tom Lee, who operated from behind closed doors, Mock Duck walked through Chinatown like he owned it. Velvet suits, gold-tipped walking stick, and a pistol hidden beneath his robes. He didn't whisper power. He screamed it. And his arrival in New York was anything but subtle. The Hip Sing Tong set up shop just 2 blocks from Leong headquarters. Tom Lee was furious. This wasn't just disrespect. It was a declaration of war. A West Coast Tong had invaded his turf, challenged his authority, and now strutted through his streets like they were home. Tom Lee sent a message. Leave New York or prepare to burn. Mock Duck didn't flinch. In fact, he sent his own message back, one soaked in gasoline. Just 48 hours after the warning, a fire broke out at one of Tom Lee's properties. Flames licked the night sky as the building collapsed, killing 2 Leong members. The source? Arson. The suspect? A man in flashy clothing seen near the scene. And just like that, Chinatown's quiet simmer boiled into an all-out inferno. The Tong War had begun. Each day brought new violence, alley ambushes, firebombings, street brawls that ended in silence and blood. New York's Chinatown, barely 6 blocks wide, became a war zone. Residents lived in fear. Business owners paid protection money just to survive. Tourists disappeared, and the press didn't even know how to report it. This wasn't Italian or Irish crime. It was something they didn't understand. So they ignored it, but the blood kept flowing. Mock Duck moved like a war general. His Hip Sing soldiers were young, loyal, and brutal. When the New York police tried to arrest him, he played a smarter game. He bribed witnesses, hid evidence, and even wore a steel vest beneath his robes, earning him another nickname, the Iron Man of Chinatown. Tom Lee, meanwhile, leaned on his political connections. He knew Chinatown better than anyone, and he used fear like a scalpel. His enforcers didn't shout. They showed up quietly, left a note, and disappeared. The message was always clear: obey or you're next. But the Tongs weren't just fighting for territory. They were fighting for pride, for control, for identity. And things would only spiral further when Mok Duk was arrested and brought to trial for arson and murder. The key witness? A man named Sin Q, who'd agreed to testify in court. But this trial wouldn't happen. Not if the Hip Sings had anything to say about it. One of Mok Duk's men found Sin Q at a local restaurant. He calmly walked into the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of cooking oil, poured it across the floor, and lit a match. The restaurant burst into flames as the doors were locked from the outside. Trapped, Sin Q tried to leap out of a window, but didn't survive the fall. It was a message louder than gunfire. No one betrays the Hip Sings. Tom Lee knew this couldn't go unanswered, so he made his move. One evening, a man dressed as a civilian waited outside 15 Pell Street, the heart of Hip Sing territory. He watched patiently until Mok Duk stepped outside. Bam! A gunshot echoed down the narrow street. Mok Duk was hit in the stomach, but he didn't die. He staggered, bleeding, to safety. The would-be assassin, an Leong soldier, tried to run, but was instantly surrounded by a dozen Hip Sings who beat him unconscious. Chinatown held its breath. If you thought the war had already started, you were wrong. It was just the beginning. What began as an insult had become a war of fire and death. The East and West had collided, and Chinatown would never be the same. While the Tong War raged across Chinatown's narrow alleyways, another story was unfolding, one that would drag love, betrayal, and raw vengeance into the already burning streets. This part of the war didn't begin with a bullet or a bribe. It began with a woman running for her life. Her name was Bao Kum. She was young, beautiful, and trapped in a nightmare. Her so-called husband, Lao Tong, was no husband at all. He was her pimp. Based in San Francisco, Lao Tong treated Bao as both possession and paycheck. He was abusive, paranoid, and feared not just by her, but by many who knew him. And one day, Bao had enough. In 1909, she escaped. She bought a one-way train ticket to New York City, hoping to vanish into the sprawling anonymity of the East Coast. What she found instead was the eye of the storm, Chinatown in the midst of a bloody turf war. But for the first time in years, Bao Kum felt something resembling freedom. She started a new life, a real life. And in that life was a new man, Ah Hoon, a member of the powerful Leong Tong. He wasn't perfect, but he wasn't a monster. And to Bao, that was enough. They began dating, and for a moment, it looked like she had escaped the darkness. But some shadows stretch far. Back in San Francisco, Lao Tong heard the news. His property had surfaced in New York, and worse, she was now dating a rival Tong member. For Lao, this wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation. And in the twisted code of criminals, humiliation demanded retaliation. So he boarded a train, not to reconcile, not to plead. He came to kill. After a long cross-country ride, Lao Tong arrived in New York and made contact with the Hip Sing Tong, the sworn enemies of the Leong. He told them he was looking for a runaway woman, and they, smelling opportunity, helped him. It didn't take long. Bao was spotted on Mott Street, laughing on the arm of Ah Hoon. the lovers didn't see the man watching from the shadows, clenching his fists. That night, under the cover of darkness, Lao Tong scaled the side of Bao's apartment building, 21 Mott Street. He climbed to the second floor, forced open a window, and stepped inside. Bang! One gunshot. Bao Kum was gone. Her blood soaked the floors of the life she tried to rebuild. The news spread like wildfire across Chinatown. Ah Hoon was devastated, broken. But instead of seeking revenge through violence, he chose a different path: humor. Ah Hoon began performing in local comedy shows, mocking the hip sing tong, especially their loud fashion, their swagger, their obsession with power. He made them look ridiculous. And the audience, they loved it. Every night, packed rooms laughed at the hip sings. But Mok Duck, the hip sing leader, wasn't laughing. To him, this wasn't comedy. It was open defiance. It was war by other means. And for a man like Mok Duck, disrespect was just as deadly as bullets. So, he made a decision. On December 30th, 1909, Ah Hoon took the stage at a local Chinatown venue. The show was electric. He roasted the hip sings to thunderous applause. Afterward, the NYPD, aware of rising tensions, escorted Ah Hoon back to his apartment and warned him to stay indoors until morning. But Ah Hoon, confident in his charm and perhaps blind to the danger, didn't listen. Later that night, he stepped outside. It was the last time anyone saw him alive. His body was found slumped in a nearby alley, shot, alone, silenced. This killing crossed a line. For decades, the NYPD had looked the other way, taking bribes, avoiding Chinatown's internal affairs. But the murder of a popular performer, so soon after the brutal killing of a woman, sparked a rare shift. Public outcry grew. Reporters began asking questions. And for the first time in the Tong War, the law fought back. The NYPD began mass arrests of both On Leong and Hip Sing members. Raids swept through gambling dens. Brothels were shut down. Smuggling routes were blocked. Even long-time alliances with dirty cops began to crack under pressure. By 1913, the violence had cooled. The tongs, drained of manpower, money, and public favor, were forced into an uneasy truce. The bloodshed paused, for now. Mok Duck would serve a short prison term. He'd marry a woman named Tai Yu, live quietly into old age, and pass away in 1941. But the peace he left behind was fragile. Because even as the city calmed and the headlines faded, one truth remained. When money, power, and pride intertwine, peace is just the space between wars. For a while, peace returned to Chinatown. The killing slowed, the back alley deals faded, the tongs, once giants of the underworld, went quiet. But if history has taught us anything, it's this: real peace doesn't last. It waits. And in the shadows of New York's aging Chinatown, a new fire was smoldering. One that would soon reignite an old war under new names. His name was Benny Ong, but in Chinatown, he was known by another title, the Godfather. Benny was born in rural China, the kind of place where kids learn to work before they learn to read. By the time he was a teenager, he had already seen the worst life had to offer. And when he arrived in America at just 14 years old, he didn't come for the American dream. He came for money, and he didn't care how he got it. The Hip Sing Tong welcomed him with open arms. To them, Benny Ong was a gift, a fearless street soldier with no conscience and no limits. He started at the bottom, but quickly proved he was more than muscle. Rumor had it, If Benny lost a hand at a gambling table, he'd hit the streets, rob someone blind, and be back with cash before the cards were reshuffled. He was obsessed with power, addicted to chaos, and Chinatown felt it. By the late 1960s, Benny Ong had built a reputation as one of the most dangerous men in New York's underground. But one job would bring everything crashing down. In 1969, the hip Sing Tong gave Benny a target. Rob an Leong gambling house. It should have been a quick hit. But when Benny kicked in the door, he walked into a trap. The Leongs were waiting. Outnumbered and cornered, Benny did what Benny always did. He fought his way out, bloody and brutal. But this time he didn't escape the law. He was caught, tried, and sentenced to 25 years in prison. And for a while the city forgot about him. Until 2 decades later, the early 1980s, when Benny Ong walked out of prison a free man. But the Chinatown he returned to was not the one he had left. It was louder, younger, wilder. Gone were the silent tongs of old. In their place were gangs, dozens of them, made up of teenagers from the back streets of Hong Kong and Taiwan. These kids weren't playing by old rules. They weren't wearing suits or paying bribes to politicians. They wore colors, packed heat, and didn't flinch at the thought of blood. And one gang stood out from the rest. They called themselves the Flying Dragons, led by a rising star named Michael Chen. The Flying Dragons ruled Pell Street with fire in their eyes. Unlike Benny Ong, Michael didn't need to raise his voice to be feared. He was calm, patient, calculated. His enemies called him the scientist, not because of what he studied, but because of how he executed. Benny Ong saw opportunity. He contacted Michael Chen, and the two met in secret. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a deal. Benny had connections, power, money. He could connect Michael's young gang to the biggest crime bosses in mainland China. In return, the Flying Dragons would be his new army. Michael agreed, and Chinatown would never be the same. But you know how wars work. One side arms up, and so does the other. The Leong Tong, now older and weaker, needed their own enforcers. Their answer came in the form of another gang, the Ghost Shadows. These weren't just street punks. They were organized, stylish, and deadly. Mostly from Taiwan and Hong Kong, they dressed in black and white and operated on Mott Street, just 2 blocks from the Flying Dragons base. Soon, Chinatown wasn't just divided by old Tong lines. It was divided by color. Red and yellow for the Flying Dragons, black and white for the Ghost Shadows. And the war that Mock Duck and Tom Lee started almost a century before, it was back, louder, faster, and bloodier than ever. This wasn't about honor anymore. This was about territory, pride, and domination. Old names had faded, but the fire behind them still burned. And in the hands of teenagers with guns and something to prove, Chinatown was about to enter its darkest decade yet. By the time the 1970s rolled around, Chinatown was no longer a neighborhood. It was a war zone. 2 gangs, 2 colors, 2 streets. The Flying Dragons, draped in red and yellow, ran Pell Street with fire and swagger. The Ghost Shadows, cloaked in black and white, patrolled Mott Street with discipline and fear. They weren't just fighting for turf. They were fighting for legacy. The old Tong rivalries between Hip Sing and Leong had evolved into something younger, faster, and far more dangerous. And at the center of it all stood Michael Chen, the unshakable, soft-spoken mastermind of the Flying Dragons. They called him the scientist, not because of what he built, but because of how he destroyed. Chen didn't need chaos to command loyalty. He didn't yell, he didn't rush. He calculated, always calm, always cold, like a man solving equations instead of plotting murders. That's what made him terrifying. And in Chinatown, fear equals power. But what made the gang wars of the 70s truly terrifying wasn't just who was fighting, it was how young they were. Many flying dragons and ghost shadows were as young as 12 years old, recruited straight off the streets of Hong Kong or pulled from broken immigrant homes in Queens. These kids were seen as disposable soldiers, young enough to be charged as juveniles, small enough to sneak in, dumb enough to pull the trigger. They were Chinatown's invisible army, and the NYPD? They were too busy chasing gangs in the Bronx, Brownsville, and Queens to notice what was happening in the tight alleys of Canal Street. For the most part, the murders weren't even recorded, but some were too loud to ignore. The violence reached a boiling point in 1976 when Michael Chen was put on trial for the murder of a 20-year-old Ghost Shadows member. But once again, he slipped through the cracks. Witnesses vanished, evidence fell apart, charges were dropped, the city moved on. Michael didn't. A year later, October 1st, 1977, two young Ghost Shadows members made a fatal mistake. They refused to switch sides. They were approached by flying dragons, given an offer. Join us. They declined. Michael Chen didn't raise his voice. He smiled, shook their hands, let them walk away. But behind that smile, he was already planning their funeral. The targets? Qin Qing and Yu Kui. The location? The Pagoda Theater, East Broadway. A Saturday night show, 600 people in the audience. Michael's teenage soldiers trailed the two Ghost Shadows and reported back. Everyone assumed a hit was coming, but then Michael changed his mind. He told his crew to stand down. They thought it was over. It wasn't. Michael Chen was going to do it himself. At 5:30 p.m., with 600 unsuspecting moviegoers around him, Michael walked into the theater. He scanned the crowd slowly, carefully. He found them. He approached. And then, boom, bam, bang! 2 bodies, 1 exit. Chaos erupted in Chinatown. That night marked the beginning of the bloodiest 3 months in Chinatown history. Between October 1st, 1977 and January 1st, 1978, 30 people were murdered in a 6-block radius. That's 10 killings per month. In a neighborhood the size of a postage stamp. Even the NYPD couldn't ignore it anymore. Reporters started calling Chinatown the deadliest square mile in America. But the bodies kept dropping. And then, just as quickly as the violence exploded, it got personal. In 1983, word reached Michael Chen's ears about a Ghost Shadow recruiter named Chi Ho Lao. He'd been trying to flip 3 flying dragons to his side. Big mistake. The recruits didn't switch. They snitched. They told Michael everything. And Michael gave them one choice. Get rid of him, or I get rid of you. On March 5th, 1983, Chi Ho Lao was having dinner at Riviera Diner in Manhattan. The same 3 flying dragons who met with him followed him to his table. They didn't even sit down. Bam! The message was clear. Loyalty wasn't optional, but even loyalty has limits. Just 8 days later, March 13th, 1983, midnight, Michael Chen received a call. A trusted associate asked him to meet at a 24-hour coffee shop. Chen agreed. No hesitation, no backup, just walked outside. It was a setup. Bam! He hit the pavement before he saw the shooter. Michael, the scientist, Chen, was dead. And just like that, The most feared man in Chinatown was gone, gunned down not by rivals, but almost certainly by one of his own. Why? Because power doesn't just attract enemies, it breeds them. And someone inside the Flying Dragons had grown tired of living in Michael's shadow. But the chaos wasn't over yet. Because the man who took Chen's place, he didn't want respect. He wanted something far more dangerous: profit. When Michael Chen hit the pavement that night in March of 1983, he didn't just take a bullet. He took with him the last shred of honor the Flying Dragons ever had. Because the man who stepped in to replace him wasn't cut from the same cloth. He didn't care about tradition. He didn't want respect. He only wanted one thing: money. His name? Johnny Eng. His street name, Machine Gun Johnny. And if Michael Chen was the scientist, then Johnny was the storm. Johnny Eng had always been a different breed: flashy, ruthless, calculated. But unlike Chen, Johnny didn't care about Chinatown politics or gang rivalries. He saw the future, and it wasn't in street warfare. It was in global drug trafficking. Under his leadership, the Flying Dragons stopped shaking down businesses and gambling parlors. Instead, they became a multi-million-dollar narcotics empire. Their product? A substance known on the street as China White. A potent, refined version of a drug that starts with H and ends with N. You know the one. Johnny imported it by the kilogram. Hidden in everything from stuffed animals to wine barrels, furniture, and cars. His methods were brilliant, his network airtight, and his profits? Unbelievable. By 1988, rumors swirled that Johnny had made tens of millions of dollars. Some said he had more cash than professional athletes, and for a while, it seemed like he was untouchable. But like every empire built on greed, his was rotting from the inside. The NYPD knew about Johnny Eng. They just couldn't touch him. Because Johnny was buying them off. He bribed police, paid off politicians, and kept his operations moving under the radar. And while his enemies were busy shooting each other in alleys, Johnny was shaking hands at cocktail parties. But by the early 1990s, pressure started to mount. Politicians were demanding high-profile arrests. Federal agencies wanted results. And suddenly, the NYPD couldn't protect Johnny anymore. So what did he do? He flipped the game. Johnny Eng became an informant. You read that right. The same man who ordered hits on rival gangs began secretly feeding the police information about his enemies, specifically the ghost shadows. Johnny told NYPD exactly when and where ghost shadows were moving shipments. Every few weeks, another ghost stash got busted, millions of dollars worth of product gone, while the Flying Dragons kept making bank. And the ghost shadows, they had no idea. But betrayal doesn't stay buried forever. In 1992, the ghost shadows returned the favor. After months of quiet surveillance and a tip from someone who clearly wanted Johnny gone, federal agents raided Johnny Eng's Manhattan apartment. What they found shocked even the most seasoned detectives. Over 300 pounds of narcotics. Estimated street value, $21 million. Johnny Eng had played too long, too hard, and too dirty. This time there was no deal, no bribe, no escape. In 1993, he was convicted in federal court and sentenced to 24 years in prison plus a $3.5 million fine. It was the beginning of the end. By 1995, the Flying Dragons, once the kings of Chinatown, were completely dismantled. That same year, the Ghost Shadows were hit with a RICO indictment. a sweeping federal case that targeted every level of their hierarchy. Decades of blood, power, and legacy gone. The old tongs were dead. The new gangs were dismantled. But the streets, they never forget. As for Johnny Eng, he served his time and was released in 2010, earlier than expected. At 52, he was finally free. But peace wouldn't follow him. On July 13, 2011, Johnny's wife, Lori, was inside their Flushing apartment with a man named David Che, a former Flying Dragon associate. No one knows what triggered it. An argument? A betrayal? Old demons? But what happened next was brutal. David Che snapped, and Johnny lost more than his empire. He lost the one person he had left. Some say Johnny's downfall was karma. Others call it the cost of the game. But whether it was greed, betrayal, or ambition, one thing is certain. The war in Chinatown didn't end with a bang. It ended with a whisper, and a man sitting in silence, surrounded by memories he could never spend. By the mid-1990s, the once vibrant battleground of New York's Chinatown had fallen silent. The Flying Dragons were dismantled. The ghost shadows were crushed by federal indictments, and the old tongs, Hip Sing and On Leong, no longer ruled from the shadows. For the first time in over a century, Chinatown was no longer a war zone. It was a ghost town. The streets that once echoed with gunfire now hummed with tourists and the clinking of chopsticks. Red lanterns swayed in the wind like nothing had happened. But behind every storefront and dim-sum restaurant was a history soaked in blood, fear, and betrayal. And the people who lived there? They remembered everything. The story of Chinatown is not just a story of gangs and crime. It's a story of immigrants abandoned by a system who built their own rules in a city that refused to protect them. A story of how oppression became organization, how community centers turned into crime syndicates, and how survival slowly twisted into power and greed. But eventually, even the most powerful men fall. Michael Chen, once called the Scientist, gunned down outside his apartment by someone he trusted. Johnny Eng, the millionaire drug lord turned informant, whose empire ended with a prison sentence, and whose wife was murdered by one of his own. Mock Duck, who once ruled Chinatown with diamonds and a pistol, died quietly in his old age, his war long forgotten. In the end, there were no winners, only ashes. But as history shows us, silence doesn't mean peace. Because in 1943, something happened that reignited the spark. The Chinese Exclusion Act, the law that had barred Chinese immigrants for over 60 years, was finally repealed. And with that came a new flood of immigration. From mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia, hundreds of thousands of new families arrived in America, many landing in the only place that felt familiar: Chinatown. Manhattan's Chinatown grew fast, and so did the black markets that came with it. Illegal imports, underground casinos, human trafficking. New tongs emerged, using new names, new methods, and new faces. The violence wasn't as loud, but it was there. Just more professional, more hidden, more corporate. By the early 2000s, the NYPD had learned from the past. They created Asian gang task forces. Federal agencies used the RICO Act to take down entire organizations in one sweep. And surveillance became smarter than any criminal network could keep up with. As a result, Chinatown today is safe, safer than ever. In fact, by 2018, New York City had a lower homicide rate than London or Toronto. That's not just remarkable. That's historic. The streets that once belonged to warlords now belong to street vendors and school kids. The neighborhood that once ran on fear now runs on food, family, and resilience. But beneath the neon signs and steamed dumplings, if you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers. The whispers of Tom Lee, the Kingmaker, of Mock Duck, the Iron Man in silk, of Michael Chen, the quiet killer, of Johnny Eng, the millionaire who bet it all and lost. They're still here, in the alleys, in the walls, in the stories passed from one generation to the next. Because Chinatown never forgets. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of the most violent, untold sagas in New York's underworld history. And remember, the louder the city, the quieter the secrets. Until next time.